The knife pressed against Liora Voss's throat before she even heard the door open. She had been arranging the crystal decanters on the sideboard in the east drawing room, the ones filled with deep red that was decidedly not wine, when the cold blade found her skin. Not the cold of winter or the cold of iron, but the cold of something older and far more deliberate, the cold of a message. "You will tell me where he keeps his day ledgers," the voice behind her said. It was smooth, aristocratic, and absolutely certain of itself. "Or you will bleed on this very expensive carpet, and I will tell the court you slipped." Liora did not scream. She did not flinch. She had been waiting for something like this for 8 months, 4 days, and roughly 6 hours. She had known from the first week that someone inside Mirev Court would eventually figure out what she actually was. She was, by every outward appearance, a human maid. She wore the grey uniform. She polished the furniture. She refilled the decanters. She kept her eyes down and her mouth quiet, and she moved through the stone corridors of the underground court beneath the heart of modern Vienna, like a ghost that nobody bothered to look at twice. That invisibility had been the entire point. "I do not know what ledgers you mean," she said, keeping her voice completely level. The blade pressed harder. "Do not play ignorant with me, little human. We have been watching you for 3 months. You go places in this court that maids are not permitted to go. You carry messages that are never logged. You sit in the outer corridor of Lord Mirev's private archive for hours at a time, and no one questions you." The voice dropped to something quieter and more dangerous. "Either you are his spy or you are his creature. Either way, you will talk." "Neither," said a third voice. The drawing room plunged into a silence so complete that Liora could hear her own heartbeat. Marius Mirev stood in the doorway. He was tall in the way that ancient things are tall, not simply a matter of physical height, but of the space he occupied in a room, the gravity he bent around himself. White hair fell loose past his jaw, the color of moonlight on old marble. His skin was the same pale, nearly luminous white as every vampire of true age, and his eyes were a dark silver that caught the candlelight and gave nothing back. He wore a simple black jacket over a dark shirt, nothing ceremonial, nothing theatrical, and yet he filled the room with the kind of authority that did not require costume. His gaze moved to the man holding the knife against Leora's throat, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Casimir," Marius said quietly, "you will remove that blade from her throat in the next 2 seconds, or I will remove the hand holding it, and I will not give it back." The knife disappeared. Liora felt the man behind her take a step backward, then another. "My lord, I only sought to determine whether the human you sought to intimidate someone under my specific protection," Marius said. He had not raised his voice once. He did not need to. "Leave this room. Wait for me in the lower hall. Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch anything. And do not, under any circumstances, attempt to justify what you just did before I give you the opportunity to do so." Casimir left. The door closed. The silence he left behind was a different kind entirely, warmer and considerably more charged. Liora turned slowly. Her pulse was still elevated, but her expression was composed. And she watched Marius cross the room toward her with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in his very long life needed to rush. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at the line the blade had left on her throat. It was shallow, barely a mark, but his jaw tightened. "You are not harmed," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am not harmed," she confirmed. "You did not call for me. I had it handled." Something moved in his silver eyes, something that was not quite amusement and not quite exasperation, and was perhaps its own unique category that had no name yet. "You had a blade against your throat in my court, Liora. And you arrived anyway," she said, "which means your surveillance of me is better than I thought, and you already know I did not need rescuing." The silence stretched between them, and in that silence was the entire weight of 8 months of careful pretending, of keeping distance where there should have been none, of her playing a role that had stopped being a role somewhere around month 3. Come, he said finally. We need to have the conversation we have been avoiding. She had known this moment was coming. She had been dreading it and wanting it in equal measure for longer than she was willing to admit out loud. She followed him to understand how Liora Voss had come to stand in a vampire court beneath Vienna, wearing a grey maid's uniform and carrying secrets that could destabilize 3 of the oldest blood alliances in Europe. You had to go back to her mother. Her mother, Renata Voss, had been a researcher, the rare kind of human academic, who had earned cautious acknowledgement from the vampire community by being useful, discreet, and ruthlessly ethical. She had spent 30 years documenting the unwritten codes of vampire law, the blood compacts and ancient vows that governed the courts, far beyond anything the modern world knew about. She had been trusted with things that would have gotten anyone else killed. And then Renata had found something she was not supposed to find, a ledger. Not the kind Casimir had been asking about. An older one, kept in the dead notation of a court that no longer existed, a court called the Seventh Reach that had been publicly declared destroyed and privately kept very much alive. Operating beneath 2 of the most powerful vampire estates in Europe like rot beneath old wood, Renata had died before she could act on what she found. The official record said, cardiac event. Liora knew better. She had been 22 years old and freshly out of a linguistics degree that had never quite felt like enough, and she had inherited her mother's research, her mother's contacts, and her mother's enemies all in one brutal week. She had also inherited the information, everything Renata had found, and the one name her mother had written in the margin of her final notebook, circled twice and underlined, Marius Mirev. Not as a suspect, but as the one vampire in Europe old enough and powerful enough to be trusted with what she had found. The one who had his own ancient grievance against the Seventh Reach, for reasons that went back further than any living record Liora could access. Getting into Mirev Court had taken 2 months of preparation. The maid's position had been real. A genuine open post filled through a legitimate human staffing agency that provided service staff to what the public records described as a very private historical preservation society. The human staff were not told what they were actually working for, kept comfortable and unaware, and turned over frequently enough that no one stayed long enough to ask difficult questions. Liora had applied, been hired, and started her first day of work carrying the complete documentation of her mother's research, encoded in a cipher only she understood, stored on a device so small it was sewn into the lining of her uniform jacket. She had planned to find a way to present the information to Marius Mirev within the first 3 weeks, and then disappear, returning to the surface and the ordinary world, and the grief she had been carrying like a stone in her chest since the night she had stood over her mother's body, and understood that the word accident was being used by people who knew exactly what had happened. She had not planned on Marius Mirev being the kind of vampire he was. He met her in his private study, the one on the 3rd subterranean level that most of the court staff did not know existed. The one with walls lined not in the expected Gothic stone, but in actual bookshelves, floor to ceiling, packed with texts in a dozen languages, with a wide desk of dark wood and a single reading lamp casting a warm pool of light that seemed almost deliberately human in its comfort. He poured her tea without being asked, which was such a precisely unexpected thing. To do that for a moment she forgot to maintain her composure entirely. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He took the chair across from her rather than the one behind the desk, which she noted immediately. He was not positioning this as an interrogation. He was positioning it as a conversation between 2 people with information the other needed. He had always been better at reading rooms than she expected him to be. Casimir Roth, Marius said, is the 3rd member of this court in 8 months to attempt to determine whether you are something more than what you appear. The first 2 were considerably more subtle. Casimir has the subtlety of a landslide. He studied her over the rim of a glass containing something she deliberately did not examine too closely. He is not, however, entirely wrong. You are not simply a maid. No, Liora said. She had decided on the walk down here that the time for the slow approach had ended. Casimir's knife had made that decision for her. I am Liora Voss. My mother was Renata Voss. I believe you knew her. The stillness that came over Marius Mirev then was the stillness of something very old and very controlled, the fine kind of stillness that had centuries of practice behind it. But behind his eyes something shifted, something that was genuine and unguarded for just a moment, and in that moment Liora saw what her mother had seen when she had written his name in that margin with such certainty. Renata, he said quietly. The word carried a weight that no one-word response should have been able to carry. She died 14 months ago. She was killed 14 months ago, Liora said, by the 7th reach, because of what she found. The stillness broke, not into something dramatic, not into anger or sudden movement, but into something that was very carefully, very precisely focused. His silver eyes met hers and held them, and the quality of his attention changed entirely, becoming the kind of focused that moved mountains. You have documentation, he said. It was not a question. Everything she compiled. 3 decades of work. Names, dates, encoded transaction records, blood compact violations, and the specific evidence of what they did to her. She reached into the collar of her uniform jacket and removed the device, setting it on the table between them. My mother trusted you. She wrote your name as the one who could act on this. I came here to honor that. Marius looked at the device on the table. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her instead, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen from him in 8 months of careful distance and performed invisibility. It was complex and human in a way she would not have expected from something so old. You have been here for 8 months, he said slowly. Waiting for the right moment, waiting to be certain, she said. My mother trusted you. I needed to trust you myself before I handed you something that could get me killed. And do you? He asked. Trust me? She held his gaze. Outside in the corridor, the ancient court hummed with its own politics and dangers, completely unaware that 2 people in a private study were asking each other a question that had nothing at all to do with vampire archives and everything to do with why she had stopped trying to leave 3 months in. Yes, she said. I do. He was quiet for a long time after that, and then he picked up the device. The next 3 days moved at a pace that had nothing gentle about it. The encoded files Liora had carried for 14 months, protected through every moment of her grief and her preparation and her careful infiltration of his court, turned out to be more damning than even she had fully understood. Renata Voss had spent her final years mapping not merely the evidence of the 7th Reach's continued existence, but the precise architecture of its infiltration into the existing courts. The names of the vampires who were feeding information and resources to a structure that had been declared dead 2 centuries ago. The locations of 3 hidden meeting places beneath European cities that had never appeared in any official record, and the specific method by which they had identified Renata herself as a threat. There were names in those files that Marius read with an expression so controlled it was its own kind of violence. Casimir Roth was among them, not as a leader, not as one of the architects, but as a courier, a minor node in a network that had spent months trying to determine what the human Maid in Mirev Court actually knew, and whether it was enough of a threat to require the kind of solution they had applied to her mother. When Marius brought Casimir before the inner court that second evening, Liora stood in the corridor outside and listened to the proceeding through the heavy door with her back straight and her hands folded, and her face completely still. The inner court was small, 7 vampires of sufficient age and standing, and the charges were read in the old formal language that Liora, with her linguistics degree and her mother's 30 years of research echoing in her head, understood perfectly. Blood law violation, conspiracy against a protected ward, contact with a declared extinct court, and, notably, the one that carried the heaviest weight in the old codes, the murder by proxy of a human scholar who had held formal research compact with a recognized bloodhouse. That last one referred to her mother. The inner court's judgment took 40 minutes. Casimir Roth was stripped of his standing, his compact rights, and his place in the court, and then he was escorted out by 2 guards whose expressions made very clear that the escorting was not going to be gentle. Liora heard him shouting as they took him through the lower hall, something about the human woman being the real danger, something about what she had brought into the court, something that got progressively less coherent until a door closed somewhere below and the sound stopped. Marius appeared in the corridor where she was standing. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You should not have been standing here," he said. "I had a right to hear it," she said. He considered this for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "You did." He said nothing else. But he did not move away from her for a very long time, and the corridor, which was all old stone and low candlelight, was quiet around them in a way that felt less like absence and more like something carefully being held. The 4th day brought the danger she had known was coming. She was in the upper archive, the one she was actually permitted to access in her official capacity as cleaning staff. Running a cloth over shelves that did not need cleaning and reading, with the practiced eye her mother had trained in her from childhood, every title she passed. She had a gift for seeing what was not meant to be seen, for catching the wrongness in an arrangement, the book shelved backward to mark a location, the gap in a sequence that indicated removal. She was so focused on the shelves that she did not immediately register the coldness behind her as anything other than the general ambient temperature of underground spaces. It was the smell that warned her. Not a bad smell, just wrong. The particular combination of expensive scent and something underneath it that her body recognized before her mind did as a threat. She turned, there were 2 of them. Not Mirev Court. She could see that immediately, the way you learned to read such things after 8 months, the slight differences in posture and manner that distinguished one old bloodline from another. These were older than Casimir. Not as old as Marius, but considerably more deliberate, wearing the kind of ordinary modern clothes that were designed to blend into a city street while providing nothing useful to identify them. "Liora Voss," the taller one said. "You have something that does not belong to you." She kept her expression calm. "You have entered a protected court space without invitation. That is a blood law violation in 3 separate old world codes. I know this because my mother spent 30 years documenting them." The shorter one moved to her left. They were boxing her in against the shelves, and they were doing it with a kind of practiced efficiency that told her they had done this before, many times, to people who had not been able to talk their way out. "Your mother was clever too," the taller one said. It did not help her. It was, Liora thought with a clarity that was almost calm, a very stupid thing to say to her in a room that was not soundproofed. She did not scream. She did not run. She threw the brass archive lamp from the shelf directly at the taller one's face, stepped hard onto the foot of the shorter one in a way her mother had insisted she learn from a self-defense instructor, who had been very confused about what his client's daughter actually needed to be prepared for. And then she moved to the door with every bit of speed she had. She made it into the corridor. She made it 12 feet before the shorter one was in front of her, because vampires were vampires and corridors were enclosed spaces, and she knew perfectly well that running was buying time rather than achieving escape. What she was buying time for was Marius. She had been given a small device in the 2nd week after their conversation in his study, pressed into her palm during a moment of apparent ordinariness while she was carrying a stack of linen through the corridor outside his office, his hand closing briefly over hers and releasing it. It was barely larger than a coin. It had one function, She pressed it once. The shorter vampire had her by the arm and was moving her backward when the corridor lighting changed. A subtle shift that she had noticed in moments of genuine security activity in the court, but had never understood until now. A specific frequency of light change that communicated something in the visual language of the court's internal system. The taller one noticed it too. Both of them went still. "You had better," she said. "Let go of me right now." They did not let go of her, but they also did not move further, which was its own kind of recognition that they had made a significant miscalculation. Marius has arrived in 40 seconds. She had counted. He did not come alone. 2 of his senior guard came with him, both far older than the intruders, both wearing the particular expression of controlled readiness that meant they had done this many times and found it unremarkable. Behind them, 3 more, positioned at the corridor junctions. Marius walked through them as if they were furniture and stopped 5 feet from the pair holding Liora. He looked at the hand on her arm. He looked at it for a long, specific moment. "That," he said very quietly, "is a mistake you do not have time to correct twice." The hand released her. She stepped to the side, moving until she was behind the line of his guards, and she felt the shift in the situation as clearly as a change in air pressure. What followed was swift and absolute in the way that things are when one party has catastrophically overestimated their position and the other has been managing threats at this level for centuries. The intruders were identified within minutes, their compact affiliations traced through the old notation, their clothing and manner carried as clearly as a signature to Marius's trained eye. Their presence in his court logged as a formal declaration of hostile intent from a branch of the network whose existence Renata's files had documented. They were held in the lower containment level, not harmed. That was not Marius's way, and it was also strategically unwise when what you needed was a message. The message Marius sent through channels Liora did not fully understand and did not need to was this: the documentation exists, it is out of your reach, and the woman who carried it is under a formal blood vow of protection from the House of Mirev. Coming for her would be coming for everything that name had stood for, since before the current city of Vienna had its current name, Liora learned about the blood vow the following morning. She was sitting in the small preparation room adjacent to the main kitchen, which was the one place in the court where human staff spent most of their actual time, eating breakfast with a composure that she was quietly proud of given the previous evening's events. When Marius appeared in the doorway, the other 2 human staff members, both of them blissfully unaware of the actual nature of their employment, looked up and then looked away in the manner of people who had learned that the private person who occasionally appeared in the service areas expected to be treated as invisible. Marius looked at Liora. "Come with me when you have finished." He waited. She finished eating, because she was not going to be the kind of person who dropped everything the moment someone powerful said her name, and then she went with him. He explained the blood vow in the formal corridor outside his study, standing with his arms loosely at his sides, in a posture that was entirely relaxed and entirely focused at the same time. "A blood vow of protection is the highest formal instrument of safety that my house can extend to a non-vampire individual," he said. "It is recognized by every major court in Europe as binding. Violating it is a declaration of war against the house that issued it. That is an enormous thing to do without asking me," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It was also necessary. I acted before asking you because asking you would have taken time, and time was something you did not have last night." He held her gaze steadily. "I would have asked otherwise." She studied him. Outside, the court was waking into its evening rhythm, a distant hum of movement and conversation and the particular sounds of a large household that ran on a different clock than the world above. "Does it bind me to anything?" she asked. "In the old codes, protections sometimes carry reciprocal obligations." "Not against your will," he said. "I would not do that to you." Something moved in his expression that was direct and completely unambiguous. Not to you specifically. The specifically hung in the air between them. She was going to say something careful and logical that kept the distance she had been maintaining for 8 months. Something that did not acknowledge what had been building in the quiet moments and the long evenings and the way he looked at her like she was a problem he was not trying to solve, but a person he was trying to understand. She opened her mouth. Marius, she said instead. Just his name. Nothing else. He did not move. But the stillness of him changed quality entirely, the way the atmosphere changes before a storm. The specific shift that means something is about to happen that cannot be undone. Yes, he said quietly, like an answer to something she had not quite asked yet. She took a breath. We should deal with the 7th reach first. A pause. Then the corner of his mouth moved very slightly. We should, he agreed, and then we should have a different conversation. Yes, he said again. We should. They dealt with the 7th reach. It took 3 weeks and the kind of coordination that would not have been possible without the complete documentation. Liora Voss had spent 30 years compiling the names, the locations, the network structure, the blood compact violations that had piled up over 2 centuries of operating in the shadows of legitimate courts. Marius moved through the old world channels with the certainty of someone who had navigated these waters for longer than any of the current players had been alive, presenting the evidence with a precision and formality that left no room for counter-argument. Liora translated. She had not advertised this particular skill in her time as a maid, but her linguistic training and her mother's 3 decades of accumulated knowledge meant she could read the dead notations and the archaic court languages as fluently as modern text, and there were documents in Renata's files that no one else in Mirev court could pass. She sat at Marius's desk across from 2 representatives of the Grand Compact, the overarching body of vampire law that most individual courts answered to in matters of cross-court violation. And she read the encoded records aloud in translation, while Marius stood behind her right shoulder in the posture she had come to recognize as his formal protective stance, close enough to intervene, far enough to make no comment on her competence. The Grand Compact representatives, both of them ancient and white-haired, and carrying the particular exhausted precision of very old authority, listened without interruption. When she finished, the elder of the 2, a vampire named Orsinian, who had the manner of someone who had been making measured decisions for longer than most nations had existed, looked at Marius. The human woman, Orsinian said, with a careful neutrality that did not quite disguise interest, is under your vow. She is, Marius said, and the documentation she carried is verifiable against our own buried records. Every notation she translated matches the archival originals in my own deep archive, which I have not permitted anyone access to in 140 years. A pause. My archivist verified each one independently last week. Orsinian looked at Liora again. Your mother was Liora Voss. She submitted a partial research compact application to this body 14 years ago. We declined it. Something in his expression shifted. I believe we owe you an acknowledgement that this was an error. Liora held his gaze. An acknowledgement would be meaningful to me, she said quietly. What would mean more is making sure that what happened to her cannot happen to anyone else. The silence that followed was the specific silence of very old things being rearranged. The 7th reach fell apart with the speed that long-rotted structures fall apart when you remove their final supports. The hidden network, deprived of its anonymity and exposed to the full weight of Grand Compact law, collapsed in on itself within the 2 weeks following the formal presentation. The vampires named in Renata's documentation were called before the compact. Those who had arranged her death by proxy faced the specific provision of old law that had been invoked on their behalf in the inner court proceedings against Casimir Roth. The justice was not the human kind. It was older and in some ways more absolute. Liora was present for 2 of the formal hearings and absent by choice for the rest. She had what she had come for. She had her mother's work recognized and acted upon. She had the names of the people responsible standing before a court that would hold them accountable in the only terms that mattered to what they were. She stood in the upper courtyard of the underground estate, the one with the artificial sky that cycled through day and night cycles in the vast subterranean chamber, looking up at the current simulation of stars and thinking about her mother when she heard him behind her. She had learned the sound of his footsteps over 8 months of careful listening. She had not needed to learn them, strictly speaking, but she had anyway. The way you learn the particular sounds of a person you are trying to pretend you are not paying attention to. "It is over," Marius said. He came to stand beside her, not behind her, an exact deliberate parallel, the same distance they always maintained in the presence of others, closer than either of them intended in private. "I know," she said. "You should be free to leave if that is what you want." He said it carefully and directly, because he was always careful and direct, and she had come to trust this about him more than almost anything else. "The vow remains regardless. You have nothing further binding you here." She looked up at the false stars. She thought about the flat in grass she had kept through all of this. The one with her mother's research files in organized boxes, and a pot of basil on the kitchen windowsill she had kept alive through 18 months of infrequent visits. She thought about her linguistics work, the academic papers she had half written and abandoned. She thought about the life that existed above the city, in the sunlight, among ordinary people who did not know what moved in the deep places beneath their streets. "When I came here," she said, "I had a plan. Present the information, complete my mother's work, leave." "Yes," he said. The plan did not account for a number of things. "No," he agreed. She turned to look at him. In the simulated starlight, he was extraordinarily still and extraordinarily present, the pale hair soft in the low light, the silver eyes holding something that he had been holding carefully for quite some time. "It did not account for you being the kind of person you are," she said. "Liora." Her name in his voice had a quality she had been cataloguing for months without admitting it to herself. "Do not," she said, "apologize for it. I am not." A pause. "Then I was not going to apologize." "Good." "I was going to tell you that I have been aware of what has been growing between us since approximately the 4th month of your time here," he said, with the measured precision he applied to everything, which somehow made it more rather than less direct. "And that I have not said anything because I was aware that you were here to complete something for your mother, and I did not want the weight of what I am, what this place is, to become a pressure on a choice that should only ever be yours." She was quiet for a moment. "That was very thoughtful of you. It was also extremely difficult," he said, and the small trace of dry humor in it was so perfectly him that something in her chest turned over. "Marius," she said. "Yes, I have been here for 8 months and 4 weeks. I have watched you be fair and precise and occasionally frightening and entirely honorable every single day. I have watched you treat your court with standards that most humans in positions of equivalent power would not manage. I have watched you read for 6 hours on a Tuesday because you were interested, not because it was useful. I have watched you choose the harder right thing over the easier expedient thing every time it came up." She paused. "I am not confused about what I feel. I have been waiting until I had finished what I came here to do, because it needed to be mine first, not something done in the shadow of anything else." He looked at her for a long time. "And now," he said quietly. "And now it is done," she said, "and I am still here. And I am telling you without any ambiguity at all that I would like to stay." Something in his face shifted, opened, became briefly and entirely unguarded in a way she had only seen once before. In the moment she had said her mother's name, and he had responded with a weight that told her everything about what kind of thing he actually was underneath the authority and the centuries. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was cool, as it always was, and held hers with a careful deliberateness that was more intimate than anything careless would have been. "There are things we need to discuss," he said, "about what staying would mean, about what I am, about the honest realities of the difference between us." "I know," she said. "I want you to want this with full knowledge, not with romanticized ignorance." "Marius," she said, "my mother spent 30 years among vampires. I have been living in a vampire court for 9 months. I have a better understanding of what I am walking into than almost any human alive." "Yes," he said, "but you deserve to have it said plainly regardless." "Then say it plainly. I am very old," he said. "I am in some ways not the kind of being you would be with if you chose a human life. The court has politics and dangers that will not disappear. What I feel for you is not temporary and not casual, and if you stay, I will not be able to be indifferent to your safety, ever. And that is not something I can pretend otherwise about. I am protective to a degree that some people find suffocating, and I am dominant in the management of threats to those I love in a way that I can moderate but not eliminate. And I will watch you age while I do not, and that is a grief I can prepare for but not prevent. Unless," he stopped. She looked at him. "Unless," she said. He said carefully, "to change that particular equation. But they are not things I would raise at the beginning of something. They are not things I would ever raise as a condition or a pressure. They would only ever be your choice if you wanted it, in your own time, for your own reasons." She thought about this. She thought about it with the same clear, methodical intelligence that had gotten her into a vampire court and kept her alive in it, and brought a 2-century-old criminal network to justice with her mother's research. She thought about it without flinching. "That is a conversation for later," she said. "A much later, when we know each other the way people should know each other before they make that kind of decision." "Yes," he said, "exactly that, but I want you to know that it is not a door I am closing." His grip on her hand was steady and careful. "I want you to know that whatever you decide, in whatever time, I will not love you any differently for it." She looked at him in the light of the artificial stars. She thought about her mother writing his name in a notebook margin, circled twice, trusting him with something precious. She thought about the way he had said her mother's name like it mattered. She thought about 40 seconds in a corridor with a coin-sized device pressed between her fingers. She thought about how trust was not a feeling that arrived whole. It was a structure you built out of evidence, out of patterns, out of 1,000 small choices that added up to a portrait of a person's character over time. And she had spent 9 months doing exactly that, and the portrait she had was clear and consistent and unambiguous. She stepped closer to him. He went completely still with the quality of stillness that meant he was paying her his most absolute attention, and she reached up with her free hand and touched his jaw. He closed his eyes for a moment, briefly and completely. When he opened them, his expression was still controlled and still precise, but underneath it was the simplest, most undefended thing she had ever seen on a face that had spent centuries learning how to show nothing it did not choose to show. "Hello," she said softly, which was entirely insufficient as a declaration and somehow perfect for exactly that reason. "Hello," he said back, his very low, and then he kissed her, with the careful precision he applied to everything important, and it was nothing like what she might have expected from something ancient and powerful and dangerous, and everything like what she had been quietly aware it would feel like for the past 4 months. The weeks that followed the formal dissolution of the 7th Reach network and the quiet seismic shift in the private life of Mirev Court had the quality of something settling into a new shape. The court itself adjusted with the pragmatic adaptability of an organization that had been adjusting to new circumstances for centuries, and the adjustment required which was the recognition that the human woman who had been a maid was now something considerably different, was handled with far less drama than Liora had privately anticipated. This was largely because of what Marius was within the court, not simply in terms of his authority, though his authority was absolute and undisputed, but in terms of what he had demonstrated over the years he had led it, which was that his judgment was sound, his word was binding, and the standards he held himself to were the same standards he held everyone else to. A court that trusts its leader trusts the things its leader chooses. And Marius had, over several centuries of consistent choices, earned that trust completely. There was also the practical fact that Liora had, in the course of the past 3 weeks, sat in rooms full of grand compact representatives and translated documents in archaic court notation that most vampires under 500 years old could not read, had provided the documentary evidence that brought down an organization that had been threatening vampire courts across Europe for 2 centuries, and had done all of it with a composure and precision that the court, whatever its individual members thought about the romantic development, could not dismiss as the actions of someone who did not belong in these spaces. She was given her own rooms in the court, not the servants' quarters, not the small functional space off the service corridor where she had spent 9 months sleeping lightly and listening to the building around her. A suite of rooms on the 2nd residential level, with walls of actual stone that she liked, and windows that looked into the vast illuminated underground chamber with its perpetually cycling artificial sky. She unpacked the very small amount she had carried with her, and made a mental note to go above to Grasse and collect the rest of her mother's research files. She was also given, without ceremony or formal presentation, a workspace in the main archive, a desk, access to the sections relevant to her specific expertise, and an understanding that her translations and her analysis were wanted rather than merely tolerated. She worked. She worked with the same focused intensity she had poured into everything since her mother's death, but it was different now because the grief had somewhere to go. The work was no longer only survival and vengeance by justice. It was scholarship. It was her mother's life's work continued by the one person who understood it best, and it was, to her own mild surprise, satisfying in a way that she had not felt in a very long time. Marius came to find her in the archive on the 4th evening after she had moved into the new rooms. He brought coffee because he had learned exactly how she took it in the process of paying attention to her for 9 months, and he set it on the corner of her desk without disrupting anything and stood reading over her shoulder for a moment. She could feel the specific quality of his attention. It was one of the first things she had catalogued about him, back in the months when she was pretending she was cataloguing purely out of professional caution. The notation in this section predates the Grand Compact by at least 3 centuries, she said without looking up, which means the blood law it references was not codified in any of the formal records. It existed in practice first. Yes, he said, that is a common pattern. The law follows the practice. The practice follows the need. He pulled the chair from the adjacent desk and sat beside her, looking at the document. You are reading the secondary layer. There is always a secondary layer in archival notation of this period. It was a security measure, double meaning in every formal phrase. Correct. Most of my archivists stopped at the surface text. In 40 years of working with this specific collection, no one has caught the secondary layer. She looked up at him then. He was close enough that it was a different kind of nearness than the professional parallel they had maintained for 9 months, the kind of nearness that acknowledged what had changed. How long have you known it was there? She asked. Since the documents arrived in my archive in 1743, he said it with perfect calm. She stared at him. And you never, I could read it, he said. But reading something is not the same as acting on it. I was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment required the right scholar, and the right scholar apparently required a very particular chain of events. Something in his eyes was entirely genuine and warm, in a way she still found somewhat astonishing from something that had been alive since before she could comfortably calculate. I am beginning to believe that your mother was considerably wiser than any of us gave her credit for. She was the most intelligent person I have ever known, Liora said. The second most, Marius said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the document. You are very smooth for someone several centuries old. I have had time to practice, he said, and the dry warmth in it made her laugh. Genuinely and without self-consciousness, and the sound of it in the archive around them felt like something opening. They worked side by side for 3 hours, and it was, Liora thought, one of the better evenings she had spent in recent memory. There was one more complication, because there is always one more complication, and this one came from a direction she had not expected. 3 weeks after the 7th reached dissolution, a formal communication arrived from the Valdris court in Prague, which was one of the 2 courts whose internal structure had been most compromised by the network's infiltration. It was addressed to Marius, as formal correspondence between courts always was, but its content referenced Liora Voss by name, and specifically referenced the blood vow of protection that had been formally registered with the Grand Compact. The communication was from Serafil Valdris, the head of the Prague court, and it was a challenge, not an uncivil one, not in fact a hostile one, but a challenge in the very specific sense of old-world court politics. A formal questioning of whether the blood vow and the formal standing it implied for a human individual within vampire court structures was an appropriate instrument, given that it had no precedent in living memory and created a category of person whose status the existing codes did not quite know how to classify. Serafil Valdris was careful to note that her questioning was not personal toward Liora, and that her court recognized and respected the role Liora had played in the 7th Reach exposure. She was also careful to note that the question was a genuine legal and structural one, not a political attack. She was also, Liora gathered from reading the communication 3 times with the specific attention she gave to secondary layers, aware that Marius's interest in Liora was personal as well as protective, and she was smart enough to raise the legal question now, formally and politely, rather than allow it to become an informal grievance later. Marius read the communication twice and said nothing for a long moment. She is not wrong that it is an open question, he said. No, Liora agreed. She is not. The existing codes have provisions for human scholars working under formal compact with a bloodhouse. They have provisions for human individuals who have provided significant service to court interests. They do not have a clean provision for the specific combination of circumstances that applies to you. So there is a gap in the law. There is a gap in the law, he confirmed, and the question is how to fill it. He looked at her steadily. The question is whether you want to be involved in filling it, or whether you would prefer that I simply argue your case before the compact without you. She gave him a look that was eloquent in its specificity. You want to argue your own case, he said. I want to be in the room when decisions about my status are made, she said. That seems like a fairly basic principle. Yes, he said. It does. Will you come to Prague with me? She had not left the underground court since her first day 9 months ago. The world above was still there, all noise and light and ordinary human movement, and she was aware that she had been in a particular transitional state for quite some time, not fully above and not fully below, belonging to both and neither. Yes, she said, I will come to Prague with you. The journey to Prague was 3 hours by train, taken in the very early morning before the sun was fully up, in a private car that was entirely ordinary on its surface. Marius sat across from her and worked through correspondence while she looked out the window at the pre-dawn darkness and the gradual emergence of landscape. She asked him, somewhere in the middle of Moravia, about the limits of sunlight. She had observed the practical accommodations for 9 months, but had never asked directly. Painful, he said, without looking up from the correspondence. At full midday, incapacitating to varying degrees depending on age. For me, at this point, direct full midday sun would be dangerous rather than deadly. For younger vampires, it is worse. The artificial sky in the court, she said. Full spectrum but filtered. The cycles serve the human staff as much as anything. Humans require natural light patterns for healthy function. He glanced up briefly. I was told this by a very thorough physician I employed in 1870, and have observed it to be correct in every human staff arrangement since. You considered the well-being of your human staff in 1870. I have always considered it, he said. It is not, despite what some courts believe, complicated. They are people. People have requirements. You meet the requirements. She looked at him. The train moved through the dark countryside, and the reading lamp in the private car made a small, warm circle around them. And she thought about the fact that she was sitting across from something centuries old that had made provisions for human circadian rhythms in 1870 and was currently reading correspondence with a slight frown of focus that was entirely unintentionally endearing. Marius, she said. He looked up. I am very glad my mother wrote your name in that notebook. Something in his expression did the thing she had come to love. The controlled exterior and the undefended interior and the way one moved behind the other, like weather behind glass. So am I, he said quietly. The meeting at Valdres Court in Prague was held in a chamber that was genuinely extraordinary, vaulted stone and candlelight on a scale that made the Mirev Court feel modern. Which, given that the Mirev Court was itself underground and several centuries of occupation old, told you something about what you were walking into. Serafil Valdres was a vampire of formidable age and bearing, with the characteristic white hair kept in an elaborate pinned arrangement and eyes, the color of old amber that missed nothing. She received Liora with a formal courtesy that was genuine rather than performed. And Liora recognized the specificity of it, the kind of acknowledgement that costs something to give and is therefore meaningful. The session lasted 4 hours. Liora spoke for a substantial portion of it, presenting the case for a formal, scholarly, compact provision with protections equivalent to the blood vow, built on the foundation of the existing court codes, rather than in tension with them. She cited specific historical provisions that had existed in earlier forms of the law and been dropped during a codification process in the 16th century. She had found them in the secondary layer of the documents in Marius's archive 3 days after she had identified the secondary layer. Serafil Valdres listened. Her court's senior advisors listened. The 2 Grand Compact observers who had been invited to the session listened. At the end, Serafil looked from Liora to Marius, and then back to Liora. The provision you have described, she said, would require a formal acknowledgement from 3 major courts and a Grand Compact vote. Yes, Liora said. Valdres Court would be willing to be one of the 3, Serafil said. She said it with a finality that closed the question rather than opening a negotiation. Marius, from his position beside Liora, said nothing. But she felt the specific quality of his silence, the one that meant he was containing something that he would say privately rather than in front of courts. She found out what it was on the train back to Vienna, when the countryside was dark in the other direction and they were 2 hours from home. That, he said, setting down his correspondence entirely, was remarkable. It was practical, she said. It was remarkable, he said again. You walked into the court of a vampire who has been operating for longer than most of the current nations of Europe, and you presented a legal argument that she could not dismiss, built from her own historical law, and you did it in 4 hours from a standing start. I had the archive access for 3 weeks, she said, Liora. Her name in his voice had the particular quality that still. Several weeks in, made something in her chest do something she was entirely willing to acknowledge. You found something in a document collection that my own archivist spent 40 years working in without finding it. You constructed a legal framework from it that addresses a gap in court law that has existed for centuries. You are not going to deprecate this." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have done it better." "Your mother laid the foundation," he said. "You built the structure. Both of these things are true, and they are not in competition." His expression was direct and entirely serious. "She would have been extraordinarily proud of you." She looked out the window at the dark countryside. She had not let herself think about this in quite those terms. She had been focused on the work, on the completion of what her mother had started, on the justice and the scholarship, and the next step and the step after that. She had not let herself sit in the full weight of her mother's absence, and what it meant that she was doing this alone, and doing it well. She felt Marius's hand cover hers on the seat between them, the same careful, deliberate warmth as the first time in the artificial starlight. She turned her hand and held his. They stayed like that for the rest of the journey, the darkness moving past the window and the small warmth of the private car around them, and she cried a little, quietly and without embarrassment, for her mother and for the 30 years of work, and for the late margin annotation that had sent her here. And he did not say anything, because he understood, as he understood most things, exactly what she needed and what she did not. The formal provision was drafted and voted through the Grand Compact over the following month, with Mirev Court and Valdris Court as two of the three sponsoring houses and the third provided by Orsinian himself, who had, she gathered, been waiting for an occasion to make the acknowledgement he had mentioned in their first meeting into something structural rather than personal. The Voss Compact provision, as it was formally recorded in the Grand Compact Ledger, created a recognized category of human court scholar with formal standing, formal protections, and formal rights of participation in the proceedings that affected their work. It was not named after her by her own request. She asked for it to be named after her mother, and this was agreed to without debate. Renata Voss's name was now written into vampire law. The thought of it was enough to make her stand very still in the grand hall of the Compact building in Brussels, where the formal adoption was recorded, and breathe carefully until she was certain her composure was intact. Marius stood beside her and said nothing, because he was very good at knowing when to say nothing. And then, because the formalities were done and the halls were emptying, and the weight of several months of sustained intensity was lifting at last, she turned to him and said, "I would like to go somewhere that is not a court or an archive or a formal proceeding for at least a week." His expression opened into something that was, for him, extravagant in its warmth. "Where would you like to go?" She thought about it. "Somewhere with daylight," she said, "and ordinary people and no politics." "I can manage the ordinary people and the no politics," he said. "The daylight requires early mornings and late afternoons." "I can work with that," she said. They went to the coast, not far, Brittany, which had the quality of wild Atlantic coast and old stone towns and light that came off the water at angles that changed every hour. They stayed in a house above a small harbour village that Marius had apparently owned since the 19th century and maintained for reasons that he described as practical, and which she suspected were also partly aesthetic, because the house was beautiful in the specific way that old coastal buildings were beautiful, worn and solid and smelling of salt and stone. She woke early on the first morning and went to sit outside on the stone terrace in the thin October sunlight, while the harbour below was going through its morning activity and the world was entirely, blessedly ordinary. He found her there an hour later, when the sun had climbed to the point where he was careful about direct exposure, wrapped in a dark coat that was more for habit than necessity at this hour, holding coffee that he had evidently gone to some effort to produce, given that the kitchen had required a complete restocking. He sat beside her, and they watched the harbor in the morning light, and she felt, for the first time in over a year, something that she did not immediately identify, because she was not accustomed to it, and it took a moment to name. She was at peace. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with courts or politics," she said. He considered this with the same deliberate attention he gave everything. "I have read every substantial work of mathematical philosophy published in the last 3 centuries, he said, "not because it is useful, because I find it beautiful, mathematical philosophy, the intersection of formal logic and the nature of truth." "Yes," she looked at him. "That is extremely you. I have had time to become consistently myself," he said, which was both completely straightforward and somehow one of the more interesting things anyone had said to her. "Tell me another one." "I dislike horses," he said. "I am aware that this is considered remarkable given the period I spent a large portion of my life in. I dislike them specifically and have never had any patience with the cultural expectation that I should find them meaningful simply because they were the primary mode of transport for several centuries." She laughed. "You lived through the entire age of horse-based transportation, resenting horses consistently," he said entirely seriously. "Marius, Liora." She turned to look at him fully. The morning light was soft on his face, the white hair catching it, the silver eyes steady on hers. He was ancient and strange and precise and warm and entirely himself, and she had fallen in love with him in the specific way you fall in love with someone whose character you have observed over a long time in difficult circumstances, which was a deep and thorough and unambiguous falling. "I love you," she said, not as a preamble to anything, just as its own complete statement. He went very still. Then he reached out and touched her face, the same careful deliberateness he had brought to every physical gesture. Nothing careless, nothing incidental, everything chosen. "I have loved you," he said, "since you threw that archive lamp at a vampire's face and then stepped on the other one's foot and walked calmly toward the door." A pause. "The calm was what did it." "The calm was adrenaline management," she said. "The calm was you," he said, "exactly who you are. It was the specific you of it." She leaned toward him and he met her, and the morning light was on the harbor below them, and the Atlantic was doing its old indifferent work of being large and permanent and entirely unconcerned with courts or politics or ancient networks or legal provisions. And she held on to him in the salt air and felt the steady, solid certainty of him and thought that some things you work toward and some things you build and some things you simply finally arrive at. In the months that followed, the life they built was not simple because it could not be, given what it was made of. The court remained the court, with its politics and its requirements and its occasional moments of genuine crisis that required the specific combination of her scholarship and his authority to navigate. The compact provision needed implementation across multiple courts, which meant correspondence and travel, and the kind of sustained diplomatic patience that Liora found she had more of than she had previously known. There was the ongoing work in the archive which deepened with every month, the secondary layer revealing itself to be only the second of several, documents nested within documents like rooms within rooms. Her mother's scholarly intuition confirmed at every new depth, and there was the ordinary life that threaded through all of it, the mornings with coffee in the archive while he read at the adjacent desk, the evenings that began at midnight with a different quality of light and ended in conversations that ran until her body reminded her that it required sleep in ways his did not. The coastal house in Brittany visited 3 more times in as many seasons. The horses he told her about with consistent and somehow endearing vehemence whenever the topic arose. The way he came to know her work well enough to ask the right questions. The way she came to read the court well enough to anticipate the pressures before they arrived. She went above to Graz and collected her mother's research files, all of them, and brought them to the court, and the process of integrating Renata Voss's 30 years of scholarship into the formal archive took her 6 months and was the best kind of work she had ever done. She catalogued and annotated and cross-referenced, and in doing so she came to know her mother's mind at its fullest capacity, the connections Renata had made, and the intuitions she had followed, and the extraordinary breadth of what she had understood about a world that had not fully wanted to be understood. She placed the final file, the notebook with the margin annotations circled twice and underlined, in a case specifically made for it, archival quality, climate-controlled, with a documentation record that would preserve it for as long as preservation was possible. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she turned and found Marius in the doorway of the archive, because he was often in doorways of rooms she was in, not intrusively, just present, the particular presence of someone who pays attention. "It is done," she said. He came to stand beside her and looked at the case with the notebook. "She was extraordinary," he said. She took his hand. They stood together in the archive, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, in the underground space beneath the city where the old world moved in the dark, while the new world went about its daylight business above. And the weight of everything that had led here, her mother's death, the notebook, 9 months of careful pretending, the knife at her throat and the 40 seconds she had counted, the stars that were not stars and the hand in the half-dark and the morning on the Atlantic coast, all of it settled into something that was not grief and not only joy but the specific feeling of a thing completed, a thread run to its full length, a story told all the way to its end. A year after the compact provision was formally adopted, the Grand Compact held a session to review its first year of implementation. 4 courts had already formally applied under its framework. 2 human scholars who had previously operated without formal protection now had it. The legal gap that Serafel Valdris had flagged and Liora had proposed the solution to was closed. Liora presented the implementation review herself, with Marius beside her and Orsinian across the table, and the full record of what the provision had accomplished in 12 months laid out with the same precision she brought to everything. When she finished, Orsinian looked at her for a long moment. "Renata Voss submitted a research compact application to this body 14 years ago," he said. "The provision we adopted bears her name. What she began, you have completed." "She gave me the foundation," Liora said, "and some very good margin notes." There was a ripple of something around the table among beings who did not often experience levity in formal sessions, and she felt Marius beside her, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and quietly and completely delighted. Afterward, walking through the formal corridors of the compact building toward the exit, she said, "You are going to say something." "I was not going to say anything," he said. "You were going to say that it went well." "It went exceptionally well," he said, "which is different." She stopped and turned to him. The corridor was empty, all stone and old light, and outside the high windows the afternoon was doing its late October thing of being golden and cold and very beautiful. "Marius," she said. "Yes." "I have been thinking about the conversation we did not finish. The one about the other option. The one you said was mine to raise in my own time, for my own reasons." The stillness he went into was the specific one she had learned to read, the one that was not withholding, but waiting with absolute attention. "I am not asking you to make a decision," she said. "I am telling you that I have been thinking about it seriously for several months, and I want to have the full, honest conversation about what it actually involves and what it would mean. Not as a romantic gesture. As a practical and also personal decision that I want to make with complete information." "Yes," he said, "we will have that conversation, all of it, whatever time it takes, and whatever I decide, whatever you decide," he said. "I will love you exactly the same." She looked at him. She thought, not for the first time, that she had been extraordinarily lucky in where her mother's margin annotation had led her. Not in the fairy tale sense. Not in the sense of things falling into place without cost or loss or difficulty, because there had been all of those, and she did not pretend otherwise. But lucky in the sense of the specific rightness of a thing, the way some things fit together, and some people fit together, and some lives find their shape in ways that retrospectively seem so inevitable that it is almost impossible to remember that they might have been otherwise. She reached up and took his face in her hands, the same gesture as the first time, and he closed his eyes for that same brief undefended moment, the ancient and the regal and the dangerous all laid down in favor of something so much simpler. "I love you," she said, in the most practical and also completely impractical way. He opened his eyes. "I love you," he said, "in every way I know how," which has only increased over several centuries of figuring out what that means. She kissed him in the corridor of the grand compact building with the October light coming through the windows, and it was, like every good thing, both exactly what she had expected and entirely surprising. Several months later, in the small hours of a winter morning, when the underground court was quiet, and the archive was lit by a single warm lamp, and the artificial sky above the courtyard was running a slow, deep star cycle, Liora Voss and Marius Mirev sat on opposite sides of a desk covered in documents and had the full, honest conversation about options and choices, and what immortality actually meant, and what it required, and what she actually wanted for her actual life. It lasted 4 hours. There was coffee for her, and something else for him, and no interruptions, because the court had learned, with remarkable speed, that interrupting these particular two people while they were working was inadvisable. At the end of it, she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought for a long time. Then she looked at him. "I want it," she said, "not because of fear and not as a gift. Because when I imagine a long life, I want it to be this one, this work, this court, this person." She paused. "I want to finish the archive. I want to see what happens to the provision in 20 years and 50 years and 100. I want to know what mathematics looks like in 200 years. It will look," he said, "considerably more interesting." "And I want to not leave you," she said simply. He came around the desk and sat beside her, and the simplicity of it, the crossing of the small physical distance, carried the weight of everything neither of them needed to say. "We will do it properly," he said, "with time and care and full preparation. Nothing rushed, obviously," she said. "And you will tell me the moment any part of you wants to stop. You will be the first to know," she said. He took her hand. The archive was quiet around them. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and two people deciding to share the length of their lives. And outside in the court the night was deep and the stars were simulated and entirely beautiful. And the world above went on with its ordinary daylight business, completely unaware of what was happening in the deep places beneath its streets. She leaned against him. He wrapped his arm around her, steady and certain and entirely present. "Tell me something," she said. "About anything. I want to hear your voice." "In 1822, he said after a moment, "I attended a lecture on celestial mechanics that I found so profoundly engaging that I went back every evening for 3 weeks. The lecturer was a human professor at the university and had absolutely no idea that one of his regular audience members had been watching the same sky for considerably longer than his mathematics could account for." She smiled. "Did you tell him?" "No. But I left an anonymous endowment for his research. He published 4 more papers on the strength of it." "Marius." "Yes. You have been quietly making things better for a very long time." "I have been trying," he said. "It is considerably easier with good company." She settled into his side. The lamp cast its warm circle. The archive waited with its depths. Above them, eventually, the artificial dawn would begin its slow cycle, and the court would wake, and the work would continue, and the days would move forward into the long future they had chosen together. And Liora Voss, who had arrived in this place as a ghost in grey, invisible and purposeful, and carrying a dead woman's work like a torch, had become something that had no name in the old codes until she helped write one. A scholar of the bloodhouses, a keeper of the hidden histories, a person in full standing in the deep world and the surface world both, belonging to both and held by neither, and Marius Mirev, who had governed his court with an iron precision for longer than most of the living world's current institutions, who had been called ancient and dangerous and regal and impossible, and every variation of formidable that the old language contained, had become, in the quiet hours of winter archives and Atlantic coastlines and honest conversations that ran until dawn, something he had not been in a very long time, known, fully and without performance, loved not for what he commanded but for who he was, by someone who had spent 9 months watching before she decided, and had decided with her eyes entirely open. These two things together, the scholar and the ancient, the living and the enduring, the human warmth and the vampire permanence, were not a contradiction and were not a compromise. They were a completion.